Sure.
Oh,
Will you send us over a clip of the recording?
yeah, I can send you the raw thing, the end as it's been recorded, if you like.
Oh, that'd be brilliant.
Minus the first
Yeah,
5 minutes where I was testing the level of it. Yeah, so anytime really. Although I'll say, I suppose we could go right back to the ancient Egypt, or how before people even thought trade unions or the concept of a trade union even existed. We'll start with that and then sort of work through to what people remember or something. It's up to you, I suppose, as well. But
yeah, sure.
okay. Okay, so when it reaches the minute mark, I'll just start there because that's an easy way to remember it. Got the Sony one as well. Are you in Manchester today? No.
I'm in Warrington.
Oh, Warrington. You said it was Warrington. That's right. Which is okay. It's just come up to the minute mark there. Right. So you're with Channel 107 right now. We're talking about trade union history, and the reason is that recently there has been what you've done is you've done a course for the Unite Trade Union. What I think it might have been that down in Blaken, which was going through the history of trade unions.
I have, yes. I work with Warrington Collegiate Trade Union Study Centre and Unite the Union, and there was a request through for a course on where it is trade unions come from. Now, being the history buffing that I am, and the trade unionist, I've often been told that trade unions sort of originate around the end of the 1700s and the 1800s, and maybe in a modern sense that there might be some scope with that. Actually, through the research and various studies, you can actually trace the origins of workers' collectives, and in fact the word union, all the way back to ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, and workers' struggles, both very familiar to the struggles that we face today. And I'm sure I can go through some of the reflections. Certainly, the debates around immigration and the European Union, again, are equally as old. It's interesting to see the sort of collective response to that.
Oh, it's interesting. That's going to surprise a lot of people that trade union history is something that can be traced beyond the Industrial Revolution, where people were starting to organise about conditions in factories. And we always seem to think of the Victorian era and perhaps just a bit before that. And when we think about that, but you're actually saying that this concept of getting together in a trade union is actually going back further. It's going back to societies like ancient Egypt.
Yes, essentially, you see a connection between, a correlation between when workers move en masse for work into cities, into burgeoning towns where there's commerce, poor conditions often, kind of workhouses. You see the poor, in order to survive, will collectivise. I suppose you might say that's a sort of natural economic factor. But if you consider going back to Rome, a massive city, over 1 million people, biggest city after Carthage for a good few hundred years, and even going back to ancient Egypt. I mean, to give your listeners an idea as to the nature and how modern this feels, I'm currently just looking at a document which is the first ever recorded labour strike, dating back to the 12th century BCE. And it's a strike that was organised in Deir el-Medina when workers didn't receive their rations. Now, to explain just a little, a lot of workers who were building and carving and what have you, the old monoliths from pyramids to statues, etc., were paid often in food, in water, in beer. Salt often is where we get the word salary from.
Oh, right. And, that's interesting, because I never knew that.
Yeah, I mean, this document here references, I'll just paraphrase, I won't read it all, we'd be there all day. But it says on the 21st day of the second month of winter, during the reign of Ramses III, while he was engaged in wars, he was also building a huge building campaign. He wanted his mark to be remembered. And of course, we all know and we've all heard of Ramses. Now, the strikers were hereditary craftsmen. These were skills that were passed to their children. They were working on tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And it describes that, it describes corruption to begin with. It describes the chief of police who were, it was feared, taking some of the rations from the workers, later found out to be true. Workers drop tools and form what the Romans would call the commia, where we get the word committee from. But formed essentially a workers' committee. And there's a note that's made on this papyrus from one of the workers. One of the workers, whose name just escapes me at the moment, but he says, the prospect of hunger and thirst has driven us to go on strike. We don't have any clothing. We don't have any ointment, no fish, no vegetables. Please can you inform the Pharaoh, our good Lord, about our plight and ask him to send the vizier, who's their superior, so that we can be supplied with provisions. We can't work unless we can be fed. And this continues, and there's a lot of corruption, and leads 17 days later to the strikers winning. And the strikers are given 44 sacks, split between foremen, scribes, and workers of basic provisions. That was the first example, but even in ancient Rome, you have in 449 BCE workers, or the common people of Rome, and I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with this term from a few comments from our government friends, who were called the plebs. Were essentially under a rule of fear and absolute poverty under something called the Decemvirate. And what the workers decide to do is they decide, well, we'll form a commia, we'll form a committee, and all of the workers of Rome abandon the city and go over to the one of the sacred hills of Rome. Now, naturally, you can understand then that the sort of aristocrats are worried that, well, without the workers, who's going to supply the wine? Is one of the comments. Who's going to defend the city from attackers? So this strike was one in which it's the first where we have a solid list of commands. Demands, sorry. And what you see is one of their demands is the resignation of the Decemvirate, resignation of the government, effectively. The introduction of a tribune, which literally translates to People's Assembly. We still have this today. We have employment tribunals. We have a parliament. They wanted the power to summon the Senate and to propose legislation, to intervene on behalf of workers in legal matters, to veto legislation that wasn't good for workers. They wanted to introduce the right of appeal, something that's again still with us today, and a ratification of a Bill of Rights, effectively. Now, this is the first ever recorded general strike from the people of Rome, and of course they win. Workers working together, they win, and a lot of those wins, all the way back to 450, 449 BCE, are still with us today. We automatically expect the right of appeal. We automatically expect a tribune. We expect the the workers to be listened to. We call it Parliament today. They used to call it the Tribune of the Plebs.
And we have some of the same struggles, don't we? Because they were struggling for food, and unbelievably in 2016, with benefit sanctions, you can end up in the same situation where you can't even get the money for food. So, there needs to be public food banks. So it seems like that some aspects of history are simply even thousands of years later, simply repeating themselves.
Well, this is it, and I think there's definitely from the broader workers' history, there does seem to be this notion. Maybe it's something in the media, or whether it's something in the in the what you might call the elite, to give this idea that trade unionism is something new. Well, in actual fact, I mean, if we want to just stick on Rome, for example, you've got two of my all-time heroes, Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius, who becomes the tribune of the plebs, in other words, the leader of the People's Assembly, and he introduces a law that says that nobody could own more than 125 hectares of land. Now, this is because when he realizes when soldiers are going to fight for the army, they're leaving their wives and children behind, and unscrupulous businessmen, the wealthy, pay visits to their wife and family and say, well, your husband might not be coming back, so how about I give you so many denarii and I'll own the land? And Tiberius returns from war before becoming the tribune, the leader, having found that now the ruling elite, the wealthy, have taken all of the land. So the poverty rates, people can't feed themselves. And it sounds very familiar to today, where you have a significant problem with housing. You have a significant problem because people can't afford land, can't afford to live effectively. So he introduces a law that says no one can own more than roughly 125 hectares of land, and anyone that did would have their land confiscated by the state and then redistributed to the poor. This is almost communism. And of course, what happens to Gracchus is, and heavily paraphrased, but essentially he uses his power to veto any laws that the Senate were proposing in order to get this proposal. Regrettably, the Senate, certainly in my view, conspire, and he finds himself very dead, to put it in a mild way, at the end of his tribuneship.
Wow.
His brother, Gaius Gracchus, 10 years later becomes tribune and goes even further, and he says that the people should have the right to prosecute any magistrate, and that courts with capital punishment that have not been set up by the people would be illegal. In other words, an attempt to abandon and abolish some forms of capital punishment. This is Rome we're talking about. This isn't the army history that most of us have been taught. He says that juries for criminal cases should be drawn from all classes, from the plebs, what we call the equities, the sort of horse, we'd maybe call them middle class. I'm not sure what Karl Marx would think of me saying that, but and even from the Senate. So this idea that jury by your peers, we think of being such a modern idea. Actually, we can go all the way back to 154 BCE.
So we're owing a lot to ancient Rome as well as the ancient Greeks for a lot of these principles that have come through, and just things that have naturally developed from workers assembling to get rights just to exist at all, obviously. And it does relate very heavily to where we are now.
It does, and the one thing that I would say, I mean, another reform Gaius brings in is the distribution of monthly rations to all Roman citizens at a low price, so helping to feed the poor. I suppose, as I think as we continue in this discussion, what you see is when workers and when people aren't divided and distracted by petty arguments. Actually, there's significant progress in terms of equality. Certainly, you do see this in the latter days of the Roman Republic, going back to Egypt. I mean, even in the first century, Antoninus Pius, an emperor, is a bit disgruntled with what he describes as a bakers' union. The bakers of Ephesus go on strike. Now, whilst the origins of the strike are unclear, we certainly know that what their demands were and how they succeeded in their efforts. And what is interesting, if you look at ancient history, is this notion of you have a Roman Empire, a one country, if you will, sharing one currency. Very similar to the European Union of today.
The Roman Empire, the size of it. Yeah.
We have, you have arguments later around who should be citizens. So you see this notion of immigrants, and you see people from Syria, from Parthia, who've just joined the empire or just been subjugated, depending on your perspective, I suppose. It's then, well, should we offer citizenship to these people? It's very similar to today. Immigration certainly has been used as one of the tools to divide workers, and you do begin to see this, as with all empires, they begin to fade and fall. But you certainly see that one of the reasons for the fall, if you will, is most of the populace being divided on forms of are you a citizen, are you not a citizen? Where are you from? Do you have money or don't you? What do you believe in? And you see this towards the end of the empire. Obviously, for those historians in your listenership will probably think, oh my God, he's just summarised the Roman Empire in a few minutes. But what you see at the end of the empire is a clash essentially of religion, a clash of immigration. You've got these tribes. You've got the Huns, the Saxons. You've got the Picts.
From Scotland. Yes, because that was where they were from, weren't they?
And you see all of these tribes, and again, you can just hear the arguments from today. Oh, look at these immigrants, who have been given land by the likes of Honorius, one of the last emperors, given land to settle, and people are very uncomfortable about this. You've got arguments around paganism versus Christianity. You have Judaism, and you can just see that the workers who have formed these committees who've created the tribunes, who've created these rights. Suddenly, those rights begin to evaporate when workers are divided among class and economic lines. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly very similar to today.
So if we draw a parallel with modern times, that could be a frightening almost form of prophecy, because we're seeing things like that now. We're seeing more and more people divided. We're seeing the division between those on welfare and those on not. Different types of workers and questioning of immigrants. So maybe our current society is at a waning time rather than at a waxing time.
I would certainly agree with that. I mean, it's not then you have a monopoly of things like education. You have a monopoly of wealth that's bestowed from the people onto what would then become the the hegemony, if you will, of the Catholic Church, and we don't really see workers, or the kind of notion of workers' solidarity, if you will, up until the plague, maybe. There are, of course, other examples, but I just want to touch briefly on the plague. Now, some of your listeners might be familiar with the Peasant Revolt.
Oh, yes.
Well, it definitely didn't have anything to do with peasants. These were middle-class landowners, but from a backdrop of plague, where 50%, or in some areas, entire towns and villages have been absolutely wiped out by plague, workers begin to feel that they have economic power. If you're a bread maker through the plague, and there are not a lot of people who have the ability to make bread, you suddenly find that you can bargain for better terms and conditions. You can definitely bargain for better wages. And it strikes me, whilst in very different circumstances, of what's happened with offshoring. You find a lot of call centres, a lot of back office functions have been offshored to the likes of India. And you find that because of that saturation of work, the laws of supply and demand fit in, where a worker might say, well, I'm leaving the HSBC call centre and I'm going to move over to the Barclays call centre because they're offering slightly better pay. And then, of course, HSBC responds, oh, well, we'll up payments. And well, you see this as a result of plague back in the 14th century, where because there is such demand for work, that workers begin to organise, maybe not exclusively in collectives, but certainly begin to argue for better terms and conditions. This sticks with us. There are some progresses from just before the plague, specifically, the Magna Carta. You have the Treaty of Oxford, for example, and you begin to see this sort of underpinnings that workers can't just be executed. They can't be maltreated or anything like this. There are sort of even the medieval notion of trial by jury. I would argue it comes back from that old Roman right from Gaius Gracchus. Now, from the medieval period, you begin to see maybe one of the more interesting periods for workers' history is that just after the discovery of the Americas, which I would be remiss if I didn't correct historians who will argue, it was Christopher Columbus who never set foot in the Americas. He certainly set foot in the Caribbean, but the Norse had been trading in Canada for at least 500 years beforehand. But the notion of colonizing the Americas, again, you see America, Britain or England's first prison colony. You see a desire for workers to educate themselves, to begin to look after themselves in a wilderness. And of course, your listeners will be familiar with the American Revolutionary War, which comes as a result of punitive tax and punitive attacks upon the workers. At this period in history, what you have is there's a connection between the price of food and the price and the notion of revolution. The famous revolution in France, of course, let them eat cake, an army marches on its stomach. Well, indeed, if you're like me or like most people in this country, workers who will find themselves hungry, then if you have nothing left to lose, then you begin to revolt. So you see revolution at a period where technology, in Britain's beginning to industrialise. So you've got a political class. We're now in the late 1700s. We're probably approaching more familiar territory of poverty, of industrialisation, of, again, lots of workers migrating into large cities in very poor conditions. And if you're poor, usually the response, history tells us, is revolution or collectivism. You see, for example, from the 1800s onwards, if your families living together in squalid conditions, working unimaginable hours, and we're not just talking about adults here, we're talking about children as well. The definition of exploitation is certainly Victorian England. And again, it comes out of a history, a very rich history, in which workers have, are always the first to suffer when things go wrong, and have a tradition of trying to better themselves, better society for themselves. And that often means working together. If you have limited resources, then you can pull them together. And this is where the sort of modern context of trade unionism really does begin. So you see, I suppose most of your listeners will be familiar with, or at least I would hope, the Toll Puddle Martyrs. And the Toll Puddle Martyrs were a group of farmers who were effectively sentenced to deportation for trying to organise a union, or trying to organise a collective response to punitive action by the government of the day in Dorset. And this spreads like wildfire. You have academics like Thomas Paine, who instrumental, in my view, to the French Revolution. But you have a political class that's incredibly worried. Workers are beginning to collectivise, and what do? If you're too heavy-handed, then you'll find a full-blown revolution. It was only 150 years previous that you had the English Civil War. So you have a civil war in people's minds. You have revolution afoot in the Americas and in France. So you begin to see a liberalisation and a relaxation of those laws that prevent people from connecting together and from forming collectives, if you will.
Yeah, and even as late as the 70s, they still, and the 80s and so on, they still were trying to stop people from doing that. Such as what happened with the Shrewsbury 24. The idea of stopping the builders from organising it. So.
Well, indeed, and you enter into the realm of conspiracy. If you look at Ricky Tomlinson, for example, arrested as a political prisoner for organising a strike at Fred McAlpine's, I believe it was. Yes, the government, a population that's well educated, working together, not divided among petty lines. So obviously people will still have the differences. It's much harder to govern, and will have to govern in favour of the people. Now, one of the origins, of modern trade unions was in, you see penny unions, you see mutuals, you see groups in the mid-Victorian period that are, when you're low paid, how do you, when there isn't a education system, educate your children? So you see very basic Sunday schools, socialist Sunday schools later on. You see people putting pennies in a week for basic pensions. I mean, we're not talking, anything to live on, but just rudimentary support. So this isn't some company doing this. This is workers coming together to put in a penny to try and educate, to try and offer some form of relief against the backdrop of a government that does not believe that it should intervene in poverty. It doesn't believe that it has a duty to assist in any way, shape or form. Look at the Irish potato famine as an example of this. This free marketeerism, the markets know best. Well, I believe that was also a quote from Margaret Thatcher. So if you like, I suppose, whilst I'm sort of rushing through the ages, and maybe next time, I could maybe break up this into specific sections. I don't know, but you see history repeating itself over and over. You see the politics of division and distraction leading to gross inequality, and you also. But then on the other side, you see people coming together, leading towards more equal society. And of course, by the 1880s, workers really are coming together, creating the unions that we might know today. The 1850s sees the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union. We see the Rochdale Pioneers creating the cooperative movement. We see engineering unions. We see this idea, this explosion, if you will, maybe from ideas from the continent of revolution and illegality, etc. You really do see that. Well, workers, no employer is altruistic, so we have to work together. This notion of removing your labour, employers really at the time didn't know, in my opinion, how to respond to this. And you see a variety of very famous strikes, certainly in trade union circles in the 1880s, the Matchgirls Strike, for example, where Annie Besant, who's the editor of the Link newspaper, shows the world the plight of the Matchgirls, who were working for the Bryant and May factory, who were using white phosphorus, which was even outdated by 1888. You see workers putting white phosphorus into their mouth to create matches, leading to a condition known as phossy jaw, severe disfigurement. Your jaw would fall off. So this notion of health and safety, a lot of people assume that strikes are always about pay. Well, that's just not true. We've just seen in the United Kingdom the doctors on strike, not for pay, but for the terms and conditions, the health and safety of patients. And this is primarily what we see with the Matchgirls. You see this notion that there are occupational hazards if you work in mines, if you work in factories, and that legacy also stays with us to today, where we have a health and safety legislation there to protect us. Most workers don't understand, that they go to work and they assume that they're not going to die at work. Well, let's go back 100 years even from today, and you couldn't make that assumption.
And yet, even with modern situations, the statistics still say that you're 6 times more likely to die at work. So there is still, even with all today's health and safety, it's not quite as safe as just staying at home.
No, well, indeed. so you've got the health and safety side of things. You also have the notion that if you go to work, then you should be paid. You should be paid in the currency of the day. The Truck Acts look at this. You see the notion of 0 hours contracts. I'm thinking of the 1889 Dockers Strike, where workers on docks in London go on strike. They receive support from as far afield as New Zealand and Australia, from Canada, to support their strike. And they're striking for, we need a contract. We turn up every day at the docks, and we don't know whether we're going to get a day's work. And in that time, that's a difference between life and death for a lot of people. So you have the health and safety notions of, we'll try and improve our lot at work. You have the maybe the beginnings of employment law. I could talk about that for quite a while in terms of the origins of your employment contract. But you see workers collectivising for the right to a contract, something that if you start work today, you accept, you'll have a contract. And yet we also see that creeping rise again of bogus employment with 0 hours contracts. Again, history is beginning to repeat itself.
And how could you suspend your income? How could you suspend your entire income for something that might not be available from one day to the next? You might just get paid this one week and there's nothing the next. And yet these are struggles that were going on, as you say, during the Victorian times. And we're going back to some of this. We're going back to sanctions where benefit may be taken away. You may not even be able to eat. So we go back to Roman times with that one. So
absolutely. I mean, the other strand is, of course, the political, which I'll come on to in just a second. But I was given a talk, a very specific talk, I should say, around the origins of trade unionism from the Victorian period onwards, and the sort of economic factors. And someone in the audience within the group, listener, was explained to me that that she'd been reading about indentured servitude, and she was inspired by Downton Abbey. Now, of course, the frown on my face having heard that, but it was interesting how she said, "Well, I'm on a 0 hours contract. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to pay bills or whether I can actually get about and survive in 2016. And yet it seems all the way back, even with indentured servitude, you were at least afforded, a meal a day. Now, whilst I would never argue for the return of that form of class system, it really does reflect upon modern society. And how far back we're regressing. And I think a lot of this comes down to we don't understand our rich history. In schools today, you see a lot of teaching of the monarchs and the kings and the wars. Well, my argument would be I don't think that is our history. Our history is one of working together and arguing for a better lot in life. I mean, I'll touch on this as well. The notion of having political engagement as well. In a parliament that prior to 1900 had been dominated by the elites, if you will, the Tories and the Liberals. You see the foundation of the Labour Party. And you see representation from Keir Hardie, Labour's first MP. So you begin to see that workers are getting represented, and not just by the Labour Party, but by the Communist Party. I'm thinking Glasgow in the 1920s, Red Clydeside, as it were. And you see this desire at the time for things are so bad that the response isn't just to collectivise at work, but also politically. and this is where you have the trade union movement. For a lot of people, you'll hear the Labour Party is separate to the trade union movement, and maybe today it is, but certainly historically, the Labour Party and the Cooperative Party and all of this were integral to the trade union movement. You wouldn't see a separation as you do today. So again, this idea of division seems to come around quite a bit. The other thing I just wanted to mention is the notion of involvement in discussions in activism. If you go back to the 1830s, you have what were called the Chartists, who wanted who wanted a political change. Now, I think being British, what we tend to do, and for any of your international listeners, I'm sure if you know anyone who is British, you'll appreciate that we tend not to chop the heads off people that often, but we write a strongly worded letter when we're aggrieved. And the Chartists from 1838. The backdrop of the French Revolution, put in a series of 6 demands, what they called the People's Charter. Now, you have over a million people descend on Kennington Common. The population of Britain, was just in the tens million. It certainly wasn't the population of today. Yeah. A percentage of the population descends on Kennington Common. I'll just read you some of I'll read you the 6 demands and see which one. They got 5 out of 6 of the demands eventually, and see which one it is. So the first one was a vote for every man. You still have this sort of sexist notion back then. Every man 21 years of age and of sound mind, a right to vote. You have a demand for a secret ballot. A demand that you shouldn't have to be a property owner to be an MP. The MPs should be paid. We're arguing against this today, but the idea that if you were to pay members of Parliament, then the ordinary worker can enter into the political debate without needing to have gross land ownership. It can survive as an MP as a job. Equal constituencies, another demand. And the 6th that wasn't enacted was annual elections. We now have... Hello?
Oh, hi. Sorry about that. I've just done a full recovery. I've just done the full recovery from Audacity there, and I had to verify that it definitely had, but it seems to be right up to where it cut off as well, so that's pretty good. SoundForge, I opened that. Absolutely not. It just said you got these files to recover, and it said, nothing happened. So when you tried to do it. So we would have definitely lost it if we'd only used that. So,
right, okay.
So, I'm not sure exactly where we're up to. I think we're talking about something to do with the elections, but we could sort of... It's up to you if you want to just quickly maybe sort of come to a conclusion, and I can sort of put it on and all that. But we have got everything.
Yeah, I'll put this over to you. You ask a question.
Right, okay, so... All right, okay, so we're just joining again. We just had a power cut there, thanks to capitalism, because looks like the prepaid credit, I forgot about it, and that just shows that in some ways we are living in slightly feudal circumstances, or maybe it was the powers that be listening to us and cutting off the power, who knows. But they didn't manage to cut off everything that we talked about. And so what was interesting is that idea, going back to Roman times there, that you can campaign for rights, that the powers that be will laugh at you and mock you and even kill you, But you've planted the seed of an idea, and eventually the right thing does tend to happen. We're seeing that with trade unions. We're seeing what happened to the Shrewsbury 24, and the injustices that they had have been thrown in prison, really, merely for organising a strike. But even in the end... they ended up prevailing as well. So,
Well, this is it, and without, I'll just sort of restate, I'm sure the Warrington Collegiate might frown upon the notion of conspiracy. It is something that affects trade unionists on a regular basis. What we teach out of the colleges, is yes, we do the general history, but increasingly now, when working with Unite and other unions, you hear stories of phones being tapped and all this. So coming back to the electricity comment, yes, it could very well have been. I don't know. We live in uncertain times. I think I was before the just capping off Chartism and the notion of political activity. And the idea of engagement. I mean, 1 million people descended upon Kennington Common. 75% of the population of the northwest of England descended
exactly
upon
you're up to as well.
St Peter's Field. Say that again.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly where you're up to. So going from there would be just right.
Yeah, and the notion of what we have today, I describe as armchair activists, people who will fill in a petition. Someone once said to me, why do you keep on going on marches? And when I said to them, why don't you join? Oh, well, nothing changes, and of course, nothing will change if everyone has that sort of idea. One of the notions of of workers' struggle is, I suppose, it can be defeating once you achieve, some moderate gains in your own rights. Then you assume that they're there forever. And I think, if I may, just want to, while I'm discussing this idea of hard-fought rights and what have you, just want to reflect upon the atrocities in Orlando recently. And it's just always worth paying attention to, the groups of people who have fought so hard for the right to be accepted as everyone else, are still vulnerable. And the thing that's shown so much out of this is how communities have come together in support. With hundreds of people surrounding that club to offer blood. So, there might be, there is some hope within me that says that, maybe one day we'll turn off the X Factor, we'll turn off the division and distraction, and actually begin. When I say fighting, I don't mean, boxing gloves. What I mean is, maybe we take a few lessons from history. Maybe we look back to Rome. We look back to Egypt. We look back to the Chartists, the Topol martyrs. We look back to even the previous generations who went to war and came back and founded our welfare state. The epitome of workers, the epitome of collectivism. And things like the NHS. And I often wonder what it is people who were returning for the second time in a generation from the World War would think about society today. They established what would later become the European Union. The notion of countries, work together instead of fighting against each other. The notion of, if you have enough money to declare war, then you surely have enough money to declare peace and to assist each other. And whilst the institutions are not perfect within the European Union, broadly it is a reflection of our history. I'm a firm believer, and have written about this around Marx talks about the internal contradictions of capital accumulation, and what a mouthful that is. there is a contradiction in workers' organisation as well. Namely, movements aren't constructed. Movements happen. Trade unions, whilst we're established today with a recent history, I'm under no illusion that a lot of unions were established, as single issue causes. We want lighting in the mines, or we want better pay, or whatever it might be. And with that spontaneity, and with that the idea of, well, no one who forms or is in part of a movement can jump into the future and correct their errors. There are flaws within the union movement. There are flaws within the political movement. There are flaws within things like the institutions of the EU, but they were very much products of the time, and we have to make things work. The attacks on the attacks on workers across the Western world, if you will, in terms of austerity, and the fact that workers who have for so long, it's always been built into people that you have to make do with little resources, because for all of our histories, that's exactly what we've had to do. We have this austerity imposed upon us. We have, whilst we're cutting back our rights, we've become divided very much on economic lines. We seem to love, the capitalists' money instead of each other. And whilst that might sound very sort of hippie, and it might sound very idealistic, let's again just reflect back on, when we work together, we really do we advance. We have equality, we have community, we have a society. When Thatcher and her ilk say that society is dead, it really does show that they don't understand the notion of working together. A collective voice is much louder than a single one, and that really is the best way that I can sum up the trade union movement. Our history, workers' history, goes back to some of the first pieces of recorded history, and I don't want in a couple of thousand years' time for people to be looking back at today and see that the end of workers' history, because we've become so distracted. I think we're in a real crossroads, and I'm sure everyone has, every philosopher, every historian, every teacher or whomever has always reflected like this. We are at a crossroads, but I really do feel that we are. Even the idea of distraction, I keep on, I've sown throughout the course, but throughout the course of the discussion. But I really do feel that the post-war generation worked together. The pre-war generation blamed the Jews. The current generation, current society blames immigrants and Muslims for all society's ills. And I think we either go down a very dark path, a dark path that we've been through before, history's repeating, or we take a different path. We take a path that we also have tried before, but we can see the benefits of the rights, and that's the rights that we've had. The idea of freedom of speech, the idea of political engagement, the idea of a health system that isn't based upon whether or not you have the means. And I think really that's what we've got the choice, a very conscious choice. Do we want to secede from the world and think of ourselves, or do we want to integrate with the world and think of each other? Idealistic, yes, but as a student of history, politics and economics, you see things going about in cycles, and we're in another particular drop at the moment.
So
they appear to come about every 100 years, where individualism takes over as opposed to collectivism.
So if we don't learn from this history, what do you think could be the worst that might happen?
Well, Marx called this the eternal struggle. So anyone who's thinking of being a trade union rep or, getting active in the trade union movement, it doesn't end one day. It's the eternal struggle. But I think the worst that could happen is the very fabric of everything we understand could be destroyed back to those Victorian days. If you want modern equivalents, then I can do a compare and contrast. Look at the factories of the Victorian factories and mills, no employment rights, some 0-hour contracts, people dying at work, giving birth at work, no pensions, people work to die, You could say this today if you ever look at the world of Amazon. If you ever speak to any worker from Amazon or Sports Direct, where we have examples of people giving birth at work. The notion that Victorian England somehow it would never come back is really untrue. We have 0 hours contracts. You don't have any employment rights, or very few employment rights. For the first 2 years of work, you're in precarious labour. You can be dismissed unfairly because you haven't worked at in an employer for a period of time. I think the worst that can happen is that yes, we begin to secede. Instead of working together, we go down lines of nationalism. We see independence movements all over the show. People begin to look after themselves, and the world will yet again be a dark place, one of blame and of hatred.
So that's if we don't keep vigilant, and don't keep and keep fighting for our rights. We could rebuild even the bits that have been chipped off already, because it's about not being divided and just working together. But there was one thing I was going to mention with Rome was bread and circuses. That's a term that's come from ancient Rome, and you could apply it now to all the division that's going on, and even programs like the X Factor or the football or distractions, as you like, to stop people thinking about the real issues and the.
This is a fascinating point. I did a study around the correlation between food and bread prices and revolt and revolution. What I found is when the price of food or bread, depending on how far back you go, goes above 40% of your income, or 40% of the average income of the country, even up to the Arab Spring, by the way, what you find is there are mass revolts. So in 1848, there was mass revolutions about Europe, and the lessons have very much been learned. Don't forget the American Revolution again was one of. It wasn't just tea. It wasn't. There were a series of contributions, but again, partially based upon food. The French Revolution, definitely. The English Civil War. There is a definite correlation there. Rome was more than aware of this. Hence the reason why, yes, bread and circuses. That's the best way to control the masses, is to feed them and entertain them. So yes, you have the modern X Factor. But then again, you also have the value ranges at supermarkets. You have, poor food effectively. And so as long as people have their bellies full and, are distracted from issues, then yes, that divisionary nature will always exist.
Of course, some people some people will always not be that interested anyway, but often they're the ones more like to watch the to be fascinated by the football or the X Factor or something are probably not the types that would be interested in deeper things sometimes, and maybe even without bread and circuses, where would their attention be anyway?
Well, if you want to look at the history really does have that nasty tendency to repeat, and I think it's because as humans, our memories are very immediate. It's only us sad people who study history, and trade union history as well teaches us that. Well, yes, go back to Rome. The riots and hooliganism after a gladiatorial contest. There's examples from Hispania. Narbonne is a classic example where there were riots, and then you look to today, and you see the football hooliganism. We've recently seen it in France with the European championships. You really do have quite a lot of correlations. Now, is that because as humans we don't like to learn from our mistakes, or is there something else? Is there a kind of an elite that likes to throw in a few sort of grenades here and there? Certainly if I speak to people who were at the Battle of Orgreave, they will definitely tell you that there was, a police, an army and soldiers who were masquerading as police, sort of becoming the, agitators, if you will, to try and provoke a reaction. So it's very interesting looking at how things like this happen. I mean, I wonder if in 50 years' time people will look at the miners' strike as maybe the last English Civil War, and what was the period in the 80s the last time that workers stood together. I really don't know the answer to that. I suppose the message is, yes, I've very briskly ran through trade union history, but hopefully we'll give some of your listeners that bit of an appetite to look back to the history of us. Whenever I teach history, I like to remind people that you're the survivors, or your family were the survivors of the Black Death. That's quite a privileged position, and you're here, in a class or in a conference or whatever it is, with the rights for things like leave, with pay or with whatever it is, because people have fought for that right. And rights can be taken away with the stroke of a pen. In order to gain them takes just a little bit more. So a message for your listeners, if I can, would be have a look at history. Have a look at your own surname. Where did that come from? Have a look at what brings us together. Have a look at if someone is immigrated from another country on minimum wage. The argument isn't to take that wage from them, because that can happen to you. The argument of gold-plated pensions. We should take teachers' holidays away from them. We could do all of that. Well, yeah, okay, you could argue that, but you'll find it much more difficult to argue for bettering your own lot in life. Whereas, again, working together, collectivism, solidarity, has just been seen also in France. Whilst we've seen hooliganism, we've just seen a series of general strikes that have literally brought the country to a standstill. The history of collective action does not always mean going on strike. The other history that we have, and maybe look to close maybe on this point, would be the notion of the other struggles. So we've gone through political, industrial, and health and safety, but what about equalities? And what about the equality of women, the belief that people should be able to express an opinion, the rights of the LGBT community, of black, Asian ethnic minorities, of the disabled, that everyone should have an equal opportunity in life, has been the other element of certainly more recent trade union history, where we are, I suppose, the last bastion now. The protections of the state are being rolled back by the government. They're attacking trade union education because they don't want us to be educating people on our history and our rights. They're attacking the rights of reps at work. They're removing welfare from the most vulnerable in society. All because it revolves around cash. Modern trade unionism has looked back on its history. Modern trade unionism has seen, we've seen what money is capable of doing. It's capable of absolutely corrupting. We've seen what power can do. That's equally as corruptive. And what we do now, and hopefully, in the future, people will look back at this difficult period and see that workers actually remained united in the fight for equalities. Just because we've achieved equality doesn't rolled back. So our fight at the moment is to abolish 0 hours contracts. Again, we've been through this once before. Is to keep fighting for LGBT, for equality rights. Is to keep on fighting to, when known people who've been on courses, for them to where's John Smith? I'm not giving out any real names here. He committed suicide because the government had taken £40 off of him. That's what we fight for. It's not. If you're going to study history, don't just consider it as that happened then. Start looking around you. Turn off the TV. Start looking around, because this is coming back. We're reverting back to a period where we had very little, and that's what keeps me going. It's what for us here in Warrington, across the Northwest, across the United Kingdom, and across Europe. That's what we fight for. Yes, I don't know if you have any sort of questions or comments on that.
Well, it does seem to be true that we're losing what has been fought for, and that's what you have to be vigilant of, because it is an eternal struggle. You have to keep struggling to retain those things, and everything being based on cash is pretty arbitrary. So with that. When you threaten just the small amount of money that somebody gets, you're actually threatening their life, because that's your only passport to society. So it's always been a struggle to try and keep just the right to exist at all. For us at the bottom of your life, you're in the position of being towards the bottom of those that control the wealth pyramid. You're looking really at a fight for survival.
This is it, and this is where when you look at in 1948, you have a universal declaration of human rights. That's championed none other by the anti-union right wing. In someone called Winston Churchill, who sent warships down the Mersey and up to Glasgow, Belfast, and God knows where else to, quote, flatten the pool, inalienable human rights. And that's what they are. And yes, our recent history has been characterised by declining membership, but what we now do is we go into communities. We represent people who are unemployed, people who are vulnerable, young workers, and I'm glad to report that we have for the first time in a while seen an increase in membership, and especially amongst those below the age of 30. So yes, if we take a step back, we in the mirror and.
So there you go. That's a whole lot on trade union history, and we've gone right back to the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks and how people had to organise just to survive, and that's what we've been looking at really. And yeah, it's been an interesting one. And the power cut, of course, is an example of that. If you don't keep your electricity going, you can't even run your house, and you have to keep putting money into it. And I'm going to give a thanks to the software writers of Audacity for helping keep this on the air, because the other paid-for programme didn't. So I was recording on two, and we've lost one of them. So there you go. Anyone, a bit of final thought? If you, I don't know if you want to do that, but I'm just generally collecting some thoughts on whether people are in or out. I probably guess already you're more likely to be in the European Union. What would your reasons be for that? Just kind of briefly.
Well, surprisingly, I've been on the fence for a while. The EU is not a democratic structure. There are lots of historical reasons behind that. I think the tendency, Europe spent most of its history as, working collectively, let's just put it this way. I suppose you have to take an informed choice. So I'll just give, if I can, just a very brief outline and maybe some questions. Is Europe democratic? No. Do you know who your MEP is? Probably not. Do you know who your commissioner is? Probably not. Can we change this? Well, yes, we can collectively. Collective we. Yes, of course, we could if we wished. We could make it a democratic institution. Has it set out, again, go back to Churchill, who called for a United States of Europe, not a European Union. Has it set out through trade, etc., the longest period in European history of no war? Yes, it has. Have we lost sovereignty? Well, that depends on what you mean. Certainly those who cry over looking at banknotes, I'm very puzzled by. But in terms of the thing that really did clinch it for me to remain, the other thing to say is if we remain in the European Union, we have TTIP to contend with. But if we leave, the number of rights that are given to workers is unimaginable. You look at pregnancy rights, maternity rights. You look at the working time directive, that governs how long people can work. And I just asked the question: would you trust the Tories with your employment rights?
Well, so it's often the Tories, isn't it, that will be in government here. So obviously we're going to fall back on that if we, But yes, not many people would trust them with that. But on the other hand,
no, the notion is that the Tories want powers back from Europe that protects us from the Tories. When a government says they want to repeal the Human Rights Act, you sort of pinch yourself and say, well, were they rights if they can be taken away so easily over the temporary privileges? So the thing that really tipped me over the fence was, my vision of humanity is one that, eventually starts exploring space. And, if humanity makes it that far, we'll look down on the planet and not see lines. The lines only exist on maps. They don't exist from space.
Yes, so just one civilization.
Do we work
There's
together?
got to be alien civilizations out there, perhaps, that are so advanced they don't have all these divisions. Oh, you're Russian, I'm Chinese, and you're American, and oh, my religion is Islam and yours is Christian, so we're all so different here. And just that basic principle of just working together, really, and just saying we're humanity. Let us, But of course, a lot of people with left-wing views in other ways would, or just in general, just still have left-wing views, have brought up the point that was causing you to sit on the fence, which is that the European Union isn't necessarily democratic itself and is in some ways quite right-wing. So you can't use that simplistic way of looking at it, but at the same time, well, it is something of unity. So we get a lot
from
of
history to the future.
So,
I think the last thing I would say is, if we want to talk about utopianism, would be that of Gene Roddenberry,
oh, yes,
who's the creator of Star Trek, and he says Patrick Stewart is seeing Patrick Stewart. I think he was some Shakespearean play. I think it was Richard III or something along those lines. And says, "Oh, I want you to be a captain on board the Enterprise and all of this." And Patrick Stewart says, "Well, that's all well and good, but I'm a bit concerned. Well, will they not have cured baldness by the 24th century?" And Gene Roddenberry replies, "Well, in the 24th century, it just wouldn't matter." And it's that kind of that notion of we've parked our differences and we wish to better ourselves. That's workers' history. That really is. It's about bettering our lot in life.
Yeah, so that's a good thought.
Let's go back to it.
That's a good thought, and we should conclude that on. Yeah, well, thanks for your thoughts on the EU as well, as we vote to leave or remain, depending on when this airs. But we may have got the result already. If you're listening before the 23rd of June, if you can believe bookmakers who only exist to make money, believing that we're more likely to remain at this current stage, and so polls seem to be showing that. A lot of them are, but it's very, very unreliable in some ways, isn't it? Which would makes it actually interesting to stay tuned and watch all of BBC One's overnight coverage. Right, so there you go. Right, thanks very much for appearing with Channel 107 on the 107 stream. Jane Martin, you teach trade union history. Based right now in Warrington. And
general employment law and trade union studies would be the best way to describe it.
Yeah, okay, that's great, yeah. I'm just about... Oh, there we go, All right, where's the call phones? Where's the one I last had on? Where is it? Oh.